Show your support for the Untold Radio Network family of shows and join in on the conversation by using super stickers and super chats on YouTube. Got a question you want answered? Ask it live via a super chat and get real-time responses from our show's knowledgeable hosts and guests. Help keep the Untold Radio Network shows running strong. We need your support. Send your super chats and stickers now.
Greetings, everybody. Thank you for joining the show tonight. I'm super excited because we're getting to talk about a work which is probably not that well known. It was an article that the late, great John Keel, who left this planet, I believe July 3rd, 2009, and the field's never been the same without him, the ufological and Fortean field, that is. He wrote it for the Journal of Popular Culture. It was an article called The Flying Saucer Subculture, and Keel used his wonderful insight and razor wit to pretty much cut the ufological community apart in that article. And we're here tonight to see if something he wrote in 75 still holds true. We'll be looking at that and more tonight on Mysterious Library.
Good evening and welcome to Mysterious Library. I can tell you people in the chat, you beautiful, beautiful people, that this man has been giggling the entire day with excitement. He has been all a Twitter-pated. This is probably going to be the best episode he's ever done. Like, we've had really fun episodes but this man has been giggling like a schoolgirl the whole day. And honestly, when we get into the subject, if I say more than 2 sentences, I'm going to be very disappointed by this man, because I can tell he's just bursting to get out with all of his Keelian knowledge.
All aflutter with like Beatlemania, but Keelomania.
Exactly.
I did meet Keel back in '99 at Fort Fest, by the way.
Oh, I know you did.
And
we're going to talk about it.
Yeah, it was a bit of a fanboy moment. I have fond memories. Keel was prickly by that stage in his life.
He didn't suffer in the article, dude. What are you talking about?
He didn't suffer fools, including myself, well. But no, it was a great joy to meet John Keel. I can't think of anybody in the entire field I would have rather had met, literally from the beginning. Well, maybe Ray Palmer, but
I was about to say,
that's a song for another time, and Richard Shaver. But at that time, Keel was, to me, the apotheosis of what you could do in this field. The whole reason I did my PhD dissertation was because I read MOTHMAN prophecies between my BA and MA, and I realized that you can look at the ufological field without being a skeptic, and you also don't have to subscribe to the ever more seemingly ridiculous extraterrestrial hypothesis. There's space in there to look at this seriously. And John Keel, better than anybody else, I think, in the field, carried that flag from the 60s all the way through to 2009 when he passed.
No, 120% on that. Like I said, I mean, yes, I'm teasing you because you're definitely a bigger fan of Keel than I am, but I respect him greatly because, to your point, he very much is, and you see it in this particular article. He's carrying this idea. It's like, hey, this isn't what you think it is. And again, we will definitely get into all of it when we go through it. I actually have a line that's highlighted because I want to tease you with it. But before we do that, I need to remind everyone that you have 17 hours left to back Sasquatch: The Legend Meets Science 2. And as we are a live show, we are going to be the first show, I think, to be able to point this out. It's made its goal. So you've got 17 hours. So you may be saying, but Jason, it's met the goal. Why would we throw more money at it? First, because you got to be a part of history, people. Be a part of history. You are going to help change things. And here's the deal. Sure, they were going for 80, but every little dollar over that just means a little more can go into this documentary. That's what it means. You are still having a hand in building what is a genuinely important piece in this story. The article that we're going to be reviewing here in a second, it is 8 pages of footnotes. 8 pages. Each one of those books, articles, commentaries meant something, and built on the knowledge that there was. This is going to be one of those documentaries that isn't just a footnote, but it will be a footnote in virtually every book and every film moving forward, because it's going to have material in there no one else has ever seen. Be a part of that story. Go prove Dean wrong here. Because remember, he's like Keel, harumph. There is no materialism. I'm just saying, wipe that smug Keelian grin off of his face. Come on, throw a couple of shekels at it. There's 17 hours left. Be a part of history. But congratulations, Doug, on this. This is going to be an amazing project. We're all looking forward to it.
Oh yeah, even this Fortean, this Keelian, this anti-materialist, this non-aper is looking forward to it, because as I've said previously, if anybody is capable of proving that there's a physical ape undiscovered by science living in the North American woods, it's Doug Hychek. He's the one who formulated and invented the camera, and then took that camera to film the first giant squid. So if he can capture a giant squid, which nobody had filmed before, he's capable of getting Bigfoot if it's out there in the North American woods.
Yep. Nope.
Before 100%. We go tonight too, though, you know what we haven't done for a long time? We haven't done hot off the presses.
Yeah, we haven't.
I was going to nail us with 3, because I had 3 books arrive within the space of about a day here. One is my dear friend Chad Lewis's the Wisconsin Guide to Haunted Places. That is brand new. I did a
nice,
and he just shipped them. I'm sure you can get it on Amazon, but I think you can go to chadlewis.com and buy it from him, and he'll autograph it for you. And Chad's an incredible talent. I think he'll be back on Talking Weird in about 3 weeks to a month to talk about it. I've got so many guests pre-booked. I'm going to fit Chad in as early as possible. Another book that arrived is The Coming of the Saucers. I, of course, have the original 1952 version by Kenneth Arnold and Ray Palmer. But Kenneth Arnold's granddaughter, Chanel Shands, has re-released it with some of her own notes and remembrances of her grandfather and a bunch of illustrations. So I think that only came out in last month or something. It's really new as well. Even if you have the original copy like I do, it's worth getting this for all the new material in it. And I'm going to pimp one final book, which isn't fresh off the presses, but is one of my favorite books in the history of books, and that's War Over Lemuria by Richard Toronto. The reason I'm pushing this is I gave my copy away when I've been doing my research for my documentary, The Man Who Invented Flying Saucers, about Ray Palmer and about Richard Shaver. I was talking to the owner of Fleming's Cafe, one of the owners in Amherst, where Ray Palmer used to go every morning for coffee. And I had this book as I carry it around like a field book, really, when I'm doing the documentary, like a field guide. And he was like, wow. And I said, well, you can have it if you want. I could tell how interested he was. And as soon as I got home, I reordered it. So it arrived today. So all 3 of those books are worth buying. I can't recommend any of them enough.
Wow. As soon as I saw it, I'm like, I know why you had it, because you told me the story.
I did.
I just could not help but laugh at it. And I know you're very much on the Ray Palmer kick and Richard
Yeah.
Shaver kick right now because of the documentary you're working on. I could not. I literally busted out laughing. My wife's like, "What is going on?" And I'm like, "You won't understand the context because they come up a lot in this article by Keel, don't they?"
They sure do. It's interesting, of course. I stole, and really, the title of my film, "The Man Who Invented Flying Saucers," is a coin. It's a term that Keel coined in reference to Ray Palmer.
Yeah.
He understood that Ray Palmer and Richard Shaver and the Shaver mystery laid all of the groundwork for flying saucers from about 1944 up until 47. In fact, 1947, June of 1947, when Kenneth Arnold first saw flying saucers in American skies, which was the report from which that term comes. The issue of Amazing Stories on the newsstands was the Shaver Mystery special. The Shaver Mystery had been in every issue anyway since 44 or something. But in this issue, all it was Richard Shaver stories and similar articles. In that, there was an article by Vincent Gaddis, one of the great Fordians, and he wrote for Amazing Stories, essentially talking about flying saucers before the term had been coined. So this is on the newsstands when Kenneth Arnold sees the sources, and Kenneth Arnold was a reader of Amazing Stories, which was a heart moment for John Keel, because regularly in Amazing Stories on the covers and inside there was artwork of spaceships which looked very much like flying saucers, disc-shaped crafts, before anybody was talking about flying saucers. And then, of course, Ray Palmer became involved with that first witness, Kenneth Arnold, and employed him, wrote that book, Coming of the Saucers, one of the first UFO books, paid Kenneth Arnold to investigate the Maury Island incident, which was kind of a pre-Roswell crash. So Ray Palmer was there at the beginning, not just by laying much of the belief system which ufology picked up in the Shaver mystery. He also ran articles by Charles Fort, and then when Flying Saucers appeared, he was publishing, as Keel's talking about in that article, in 1975, which he wrote in 73. So he wrote that before Shaver was actually dead by the time that was published. But Shaver was still alive when he wrote the article. In that, he's actually talking that flying saucers, Ray Palmer's Flying Saucers, is the largest circulation, the magazine with the largest circulation on the planet, so regarding flying saucers. So Keel understood the influence of Ray Palmer from the beginning. And so many people have forgotten now, just like so many people have forgotten much of what John Keel said.
Yeah. And there were some things in here that Keel was talking about, particularly when you get to like the 1800s, that I wasn't aware of, right? There's a couple of things I'm going to have to look up because, again, you and I share the same opinion on UFOs. But it was, there was material in there that I wasn't even aware of. Again, particularly some of the, the material from the 1800s. And I kind of want to start at the beginning because one of the things he does very, very well, although a little pointed, like you said, he was a little you said he was a little prickly in his old age, and I'm like, he was prickly in the article too. Like and again, I understand what he was doing and why, but he definitely was very pointed at his critique of the subculture, and that's really what this is about. I do like that he goes out of his way to delineate between the believer and the witness, which he does. He calls out everybody. I have it saved. I have it highlighted, the section I'm going to read, because I'm going to point at you and I'm going to laugh. But he is very critical of just about everybody in this. And in one of his very first critiques is how the subject of the contactee and or the witness and the believer are often overlapped, and that's not the case.
Well, I think his point is a lot of the social scientists who jumped on the bandwagon early didn't delineate between witness and believer. They didn't understand there was a big difference. And Keel, of course, is somebody who was operating inside the subculture, even though himself he was very much removed from the ETH. He was still, for much of the period he's writing about, he was one of the hottest ufologists on the planet. John Keel was really in popularity as far as going to conventions and things, probably second to very few people in that period. So he knew of what he spoke. He was there in the midst of it. And he's super critical of people who are in essentially what I think he calls it cultic thinking, you know, the
Yeah.
people who subscribe so aggressively to the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And I know this isn't the part you'll read, but I just thought of it then when I was talking. I know exactly
Mhm.
where it is, so it's probably worth me reading if I can without blocking my light too much. And that is, ufology has been a propaganda movement rather than a scientific movement. The
Yes.
ufologists the ufologists began stumping for a myth in the late 1940s before the sighting evidence was even empirical, and that's the
Mhm.
extraterrestrial hypothesis, which he goes on to talk about. Additional myths were gradually developed and absorbed into the main premise, the extraterrestrial hypothesis, while the mounting correlations between UFO and psychic phenomenon were ignored or even suppressed by the ET believers. It wasn't by the US Air Force or the CIA. So he's saying, while the UFO believers are all out there shaking their fists at the government, saying you're suppressing the reality of flying saucers, in Keel's mind, it was the extraterrestrial believers themselves who were suppressing those reports and stories which clearly positioned UFO belief within an older occultic tradition, I
Yeah.
suppose.
So I want to talk about the part of that you are focusing on, because I completely agree. That is literally the line I was going to read.
Oh, get
That is
out of
the one.
town. Are you for
Uh-huh.
real?
Yeah.
Sorry I stole it from you then.
Oh,
I
it's
thought
okay. No,
this
no.
can't be the one he's gonna point at me and laugh, because this is the
Mhm.
one that I was like, pointing and
Oh, I know.
laughing.
Yeah, exactly. Well, but see, here's the thing. I think the I love it when we get a chance to actually butt heads a little bit on this.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so let's start on that one, because here's the deal. I agree with his perspective, right? In so much as, um, and again, I think your perspective as well, to what he's saying is, hey, the psychic phenomena, the clearly more uh paraphysical, and metaphysical material, that it's clearly there, and there's these older traditions. It was the system itself. It's the UFO believers themselves who were eschewing this and pushing it out of the conversation, and forbidding its consideration over, and that's, I'll stop there because it's the second half I want to focus on. But he's 100% right there in that critique, which is, and we see this in a lot of different groups, right? Again, where you have these camps where it does become very cult like, where it's like, this is the answer, this is your one response, this is the paradigm within which you are allowed to work. And over time, that paradigm gets smaller and smaller and smaller. The interpretations of the events become dogmatic, and that's the only conversation you can have. And you come and you say, okay, but hold on, what about this over here? Oftentimes the accounts of eyewitnesses are changed, or thrown out entirely. We've talked about this on this channel many, many times. Um, Encounters with that clearly are not material have often been suppressed, which is why it's interesting how a lot of some of the documentaries and things that we've discussed, and even articles we've discussed the last few months, are, even from some of the more mainstream groups, are starting to include this other phenomena and some of these other perspectives in there, which is literally up until the last 2 years, it was an anathema for MUFON to talk about the supernatural or even psychic phenomena, like beyond, okay, maybe they can talk to you telepathically, like that was it. But they're starting to get into this a little bit more, saying maybe they're not necessarily what we think. Maybe they represent something larger than just ET from another planet, right? They're not Klingons, right? They may represent something more bizarre, something more strange. And that there may be a connection between psychic phenomena and psychic abilities in those who have these encounters.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I didn't hear you laughing at me though. I was waiting for the laughing at me part.
Oh, I just want to give you a chance to respond to that,
Oh,
because
okay.
I'm going to point and laugh real hard.
No, I think that Keel had wonderful grasp very early on, as incidentally did Ray Palmer, who he mentions. Palmer was also
Yes.
talking about the spiritual, aspects
Mhm.
of the
Yeah.
flying saucer culture, as were other people, which, as Keel also fairly mentions in there. But what became popular was the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And it's
Yes.
interesting, at the end of the booklet that I have here, I used to have a copy which Keel signed for me, and Doug Skinner, the artist of the wonderful cover, which I'll pop up very quickly on the screen here. The cover
Mhm.
is just a beautiful cover of the actual booklet. You can't get that booklet. That was something that John used to take and I think sell for a very small amount, probably the cost of printing at conventions he went
Mhm.
to. So I'd lost my copy, and Doug Skinner had a copy, which he sent me recently, the artist of it, of the
Oh,
cover, and
wow.
who now runs johnkeel.com, that people should go and check out. In many ways, Doug Skinner is John Keel's, I suppose, literary heir. He's the person who got all the
Mhm.
notes and all the Keel materials, and has been helpful with me on the documentary. I like Doug Skinner a lot, just as I like Keel.
Mhm.
But
I do like that cover.
oh, the
That
cover's
is.
fantastic. It's just worth, if you're on
Yeah.
if you have a big screen TV or something, you can see, like, there's the Darrow on it, and there's the
Mhm.
Hopkinsville Goblins, and
Yeah.
there's a Damsky type Space Brothers, there's Men in Black, there's Grey Aliens, there's all kinds of things. So anyway, Keel was very cognizant of all of this stuff early on. And when he's writing, there are still people in the field who are
Mhm.
kind of the giants of the field as well when he
Oh,
wrote it.
yeah.
My point is, at the end of that, which is something he wrote later, which I think only ever appears in that booklet, he wrote it 20 years after, because that was published in 75 originally in the
Mhm.
Journal of Popular Culture, but he says he wrote it in 1973. So he wrote a new forward in 93. And it's so sad when you're reading it, how everybody's gone. Like, he's like, Shaver's
Yeah.
gone, Palmer's gone. He's talking about all the giants of the field. They're all gone. Like, he's just, Hynek's gone. And he's saying everybody who's left are just all these incompetent people. The field's got
Mhm.
nobody there anymore. And to a degree, he was right. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not polite to say, but I find today in the ufological field itself, and I'll say there are probably a couple of people who I don't consider in here. I won't say who they are, because then you'll go, well, you mean everybody else is bad except those two people? But for the most part, there's nobody left carrying that Keelian banner correctly, or even forget about the Keelian, the Fortean banner, because John Keel considered himself a Fortean. He understood that
Mhm.
Fort was writing with tongue in cheek, and he didn't
Yeah.
trust the orthodoxies, and neither did Keel. And
Right.
so there was this wonderful humor in Fort's writing. There's wonderful humor and wit in John's writing. And now there's nobody doing that. There really isn't. And I think we're at a loss for that. The one person who I think who I always vacillate between who was the greatest in the field was John Keel and Jacques Vallee.
Yeah.
Now, John Keel passed without having thrown his hat in the ring with the crash saucers and little men stories, which Vallee's done recently in
Right.
Trinity, the best kept secret book. Keel's making fun of that still in the afterward, which he wrote in 93, and saying
Yes.
ufologists are coming out with that story now that it essentially came from Ray Palmer back in 1945 and Amazing
Mhm.
Stories. So it's so funny to once again see Palmer's influence. But Keel never succumbed to any of that, any of the literalism which which continued to haunt ufology. Keel talks in that the new ufology is rising. Like, as scathing as it is, that article about the current
Yes.
state of ufology, he presents that there's these new people coming, including himself, of course, but there's Brad Steiger, and there's Jacques
Mhm.
Vallee, and he mentions, a number of other people, the kind of new ufology that are seeing these older cultural links and are looking at the psychological
Mhm.
and the social aspects more. And there were people incidentally, one of the people who has carried that and is almost forgotten is Martin Kottmeyer. He's still alive. Kottmeyer
Yeah.
did fantastic work in that space. He still does. But my point is that it seems like, oh, ufology is moving to a wonderful place. When he writes 20 years later, he's like, no, they're all gone and there's nothing left. Almost like it's the final things. It's more
Yeah.
pessimistic. The new
Yes.
forward, or the new afterward, he writes 20 years later, is far more pessimistic than that piece. And that piece is pessimistic enough, but it ends on the
Oh,
sense
yeah.
there's a new ufology. We're going to get somewhere. Keel
Yeah.
didn't see that it was going to be the old ufology which would dominate, and it still has. I mean, this is even his new afterward was written
Yeah.
before the X-Files. It was
Mhm.
written after perhaps the influence of Doty and Benowitz, the Benowitz affair, and William Moore, and all of those people had thrown that stuff into ufology.
Yeah.
And so in 73 73, you probably couldn't have predicted that it was going to become even more paranoid. It was going to become even more extraterrestrial orientated. That was going to
Yeah.
go to the places which he just spent the first, you know, 2/3 of the article criticizing. But that's exactly where it went. And I think Keel was always disappointed that he never saw it go where he thought it was.
No,
So where he thought it
I
was
agree.
going in 73.
Yeah. No, I'm right there with you. I agree. I think that's exactly what happened. And this is where I wanted to, again, sort of point and laugh just a little bit, because it's I can't believe we pulled the same line. The
Hilarious.
exact same line. It's the very end of it where again, I agree, it was, you know, the believers themselves that were pushing out the other material, right? They said, but not the USAF or CIA. However, as you just pointed out, with Richard Doty, all the others, we now know for a fact that the United States military and the CIA have had a wow, it's like my have had wow. Okay, there we are. Now I'm back. Have had a very heavy-handed control over the UFO movement and over the believers. They've been it's been deliberately manipulated for their own agenda. And as we've discussed on the channel many times, I think it goes all the way back to the beginning itself, right? And for obvious reasons. Again, we don't necessarily need to go into that now. I think we're going to have plenty of opportunities to talk about, talk about it. Particularly, I just forgot his name. The guy who saw the first.
Kenneth Arnold.
Kenneth Arnold, thank you. Just his name just flew out. But again, comparing the saucers that Kenneth Arnold saw with the initial jet-powered flying wings that the Luftwaffe was working on, right? You put those side by side; they're the same. They're basically the same thing. And even the designs of the gentleman who initially created the SR-71, the U-2, the blended body material, whose name, again, I'm terrible with names right now, not that I'm ever good with them. He talks about seeing UFOs, right? Well, the UFO he draws out is very similar to the one Kenneth Arnold saw, right? And you you compare that with the flying wing, you're like, okay, so maybe that is what they were saying. They were seeing literally Nazi flying wings that were being flown over here and experimented on and with and studied. And so the entirety of the UFO movement's probably been manipulated since day one by the CIA, by the United States military-industrial complex. And so I find that one line in many ways very, very telling, because he couldn't see how manipulated the entire thing really was at that time. He knew there was something, but he doesn't. In the article, it's very much on the people, but that's that blinder that he himself had, which is he couldn't see how much of the subject was being actively manipulated by intelligence agencies.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I also think, in fairness to Keel, he does something in that piece in 75, which most people at the time were probably not particularly conscious of.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about the various government UFO programs fairly objectively, I think. Like, he doesn't mention the Robertson panel by name, but it's in there. Obviously, Blue Book and Grudge and those things are in there. And he does talk about how there seemed to be people in the Air Force who jumped on the extraterrestrial bandwagon and were very sympathetic to it, which is true. And they were even writing forwards for civilian, UFO authors' books and saying, well, this person's done wonderful research.
Yes.
So he makes a point of saying that. I think Keel, and I'm sympathetic with this as well, and I always have been a little bit. I think some of those US Air Force people weren't immune from the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Just because you're wearing a uniform doesn't mean you don't have a belief system.
Right.
Doesn't mean that you don't read a UFO tabloid or hear the stories and think these things must be extraterrestrial.
Yes.
And that could be because of what you're talking about, a type of compartmentalism where maybe the front man for Blue Book doesn't have any idea of what's happening, in Skunk Works. That could very well be the case. It could also just be, again, a case of cultural contamination, even for the officers in the Air Force who jump on that belief system. So I think Keel, in a way, he also doesn't yet in 73 have the perhaps understanding that we get after William Moore stands up at the MUFON
Right.
symposium in 1989 and
Mhm.
says, I was a Richard Doty AFOSI asset, and I was spying on you, and I was feeding you disinformation, and yada yada yada.
Yeah.
A lot of that, which ends up justifying perhaps some of the paranoia, wasn't really well known at the time. And
Yeah.
I still think that hasn't been taken on by the UFO community. The
It
UFO
hasn't, no.
community takes that on to think, oh, see, they're hiding UFO secrets. Well, I take that on and to think how
Mhm.
much of the UFO belief system has been manipulated
Yes.
by people within those type of positions. I'm less concerned of whether they're covering up UFO secrets or not, because there's no way I can determine that or not as a social scientist. What I can determine is I can trace a belief system and see
Yeah.
where that belief gets injected into the UFO body politic,
Yes.
where it comes from. And that's what fascinates me. So again, I see your point that Keel, much like Vallee, both of those men thought that government bodies probably knew no more about flying saucers than the rest of us. That was pretty much the common position of those people positioned in that
Yes.
camp right through the 1970s. So
Yes.
Keel wasn't, I think, on the evidence that he had, I don't think he drew any I don't think he drew any wrong conclusions on what the evidence he was looking at. Now, to your point, was there manipulation of UFO belief? Oh, certainly. There was
Mhm.
certainly a manipulation of UFO belief.
Oh, yeah.
But was the government actually suppressing any UFO truths, which is one of Keel's points that the UFO people accuse the government of doing? Well, I don't know what the UFO truths are, so they mightn't be suppressing any UFO truth. They might just be spinning the story. So I see your critique of Keel there, but
Yeah.
it wouldn't be as scathing as if we found out tomorrow that they had UFO secrets they were actually holding and Keel got it wrong and there were crash sources really in the basement of Area 51.
So let me push back on that real quick to Grandmaster UV. I was actually just on Rob's show, Beyond BMR. Tex had called out, so I was helping him out. But yeah, so let me push back on that because I get what you're saying. And again, like I said, it is in a laughing is hyperbolic because I just found that a little ironic, that line. Knowing what we know now, obviously he wouldn't have necessarily known. Because clearly he wasn't.
Well, nobody knew in 73.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, and I mean, John Keel would not have been the person to say the government is. He's not one of those. He's not one of those people who would be very YouTube safe. That would say the government has never done anything wrong, and they are our best and brightest, and have our best intentions at heart. Like he would not be one of those people, right?
And incidentally, just quickly, before Benowitz, I'm not
Yeah.
sure if there was any interjection of UFO belief by the government into the community. I think there was a happiness to spin stories so you could cover up U-2 spy planes which were spotted in the skies and just say they were UFOs. I'm unaware still as a UFO historian who I think has a fairly firm grasp on this, of any intentional injection of narrative by any US government agency into the field prior to the Benowitz affair and prior to Linda Moulton Howe being shown things, prior to MJ-12 documents, all of that stuff which comes out of a handful of operatives in the late 70s, early 80s.
Right, and that's fair, right? I think there's a difference between saying, what we know Richard Doty did, which again, the very hands-on nature of it, is different. Is potentially very different from what was happening before that. Because again, I think because we've lived with that material our entire lives, it's very easy for us to forget the UFO subculture that Keel is addressing is radically different from what it is today. And one of the reasons for that is there wasn't, honestly, probably there wasn't the same level of intervention and manipulation by the government. It was a little bit more natural, but that being said, it was still being manipulated, right? There was still some level of activity to the point of, even if it's just spinning the stories. However, this goes back to the point of if they are spinning the stories, they are hiding the truth, even if the truth is they're ours, right? Obviously, you and I have we don't believe everything that's being seen or encountered is a governmental system. However, a lot of it is. In fact, now Keel does address that for a long time, people were actually not all that fond of the idea of them being extraterrestrial craft, but rather some sort of secret project that was being worked on. That was actually the default. And it's interesting how in the last 40 years, the default is now aliens.
Well, that's because of
Instead
Ray.
the system.
To be honest, that's because of Ray Palmer. All of this traces
Yeah.
back to him laying the groundwork and then beating the drum the hardest.
Mhm.
In another article, Keel writes, literally the one which is the man who invented flying saucers. He says that in the early days when there was no interest, it was Ray Palmer who beat the drum the hardest for this stuff.
Mhm.
So again, you're right. Initially, when you look at those early polls in the late 40s in America, nobody even considered it was extraterrestrial unless they were reading a
No.
Ray Palmer publication. Like
Yeah.
most of your average, or if they were a member of some occult group, right? Your average or a hardcore 40 and was already really familiar with the works of Charles Fort. Most of Americans who were polled thought it was things like our own technology, weather balloons, misidentifications of astronomical phenomena, all of that stuff. At the bottom, there was, I think, in a Roper poll or something back in, I don't know, the late 40s, early 50s. At the very bottom, there was 5% which said other. It didn't even say ET. So anybody who believed in ET was somewhere in that 5% other. All of the other things were very mundane, rational explanations. So it really took the, I suppose, even bursting out of Palmer, who I really think Palmer helped, as Keel said, get that into the kind of broader consciousness. But then it took articles by people like Kehoe in Look magazine, and it took science fiction movies, and it took all of that in that window from the late 40s into the first couple of years of the 50s to really get that extraterrestrial idea out there. Certainly in 47, people weren't jumping to the conclusion that it was extraterrestrial. Again, unless they were Ray Palmer and Richard Shaver in the pages of Amazing Stories, who said it straight away.
Right.
This is the Darrow from the caves. This is their
caves,
ET friends who come back and forward.
No, absolutely. What's interesting is he does point out that at that point, the popular belief among scientists and even about Eisenhower was there's no such, the odds of life existing on other planets are astronomical, if not just completely impossible. In fact, Eisenhower wasn't even a big fan of the idea of using rockets to get into space. He actually said, "No, let's not bother with that because it's pointless." Now, again, he was clearly proven wrong, but it is interesting that there was a shift. I don't want to get too far afield but I honestly think that shift is in itself sort of indicative of that manipulation by the intelligence agencies to begin with. That we know that the CIA and these other groups were very, very active during that time to control narratives, to control these ideas. Now, again, to what extent we can't say, but I do find that flip very interesting. And again, maybe it was just they were riding a wave. And again, like you said, you had Palmer pushing it. You had the rise of, particularly with the space age, you have all these shows, and you've got kids who grew up on Buck Rogers are now seeing rockets go into space, which then gives you Star Trek. And so by the time you get there, it's all been laid out. So it's becoming popular. Maybe they're just riding a wave that culminates with that manipulation.
I think a lot of it we can look at as a cultural historian who's been interested in this for a long time. I think a lot of this we can look at just as the growth of post-World War II and space and pre-space age culture. And of course, again, we can point at the identities and the movies and the books and the magazines which help fuel the fire. But I don't need a conspiracy type theory to see the interjection of this into the body politic. I can see the evolution of it pretty clearly. I do think that intelligence agencies, the CIA themselves have admitted, we're happy to play with these ideas to cover up secret projects. I think there's no doubt, at least from whatever operation was going on in New Mexico around Benowitz and the stuff Linda Moulton Howe was showing, that there were some components of at least Air Force intelligence who thought we can have all kinds of fun's the wrong word, but we can do all kinds of things by peddling this kind of disinformation. But how far that extends, I don't know. I think the danger is when we start to look at the involvement, and I think there is some, the danger then becomes sliding into what Keel warns about, the idea
Right.
that, well, the government know all the UFO secrets and they're keeping it from us. And that's what has happened with the UFO community.
Yeah.
What's happened is the disclosure that
Mhm.
Kehoe was fighting for, which Keel talks about all the way back in the 50s, when incidentally,
Mhm.
at first Kehoe had access to Air Force intelligence. They were giving him
Yeah.
information, and then they cut it off, and then he was shaking his fist even harder,
Yeah.
wanting the doors to be
Mhm.
open. So going back to Kehoe in the mid-50s, with that was his focus. Today, that's still the focus of people. Has it gotten us anywhere? And I think that was Keel's point back in 75.
Right. And I would agree with that. No, yeah.
And we've talked about it before, actually.
Oh,
We've
yeah.
talked about just waiting for disclosure, thinking that the government knows all the secrets and is going to give them to us, gets the
Mhm.
research community nowhere and furthers our understanding of the phenomenon, not one iota. Because
Mm-mm.
if that's your default, if that's the way you think you're going to work out and let's be honest, it's not even people thinking they're going to work out the UFO secrets. The people who want
Yeah.
disclosure already think they know the UFO secrets. They
Right.
think a craft crashed in Roswell, there are little gray
Mhm.
men, there are alien abductions. The X-Files narrative all is essentially true.
Yeah.
And they just want the government to come out and tell them what you believe is true. They
Yeah.
don't really want they don't want an actual, an interjection of information they don't know. They just want disclosure. In other words, tell me what I believe is the truth.
Yeah, they want
Stamp what I
validation of
Yeah.
their pre-existing opinion
Pretty
of their
much.
dogma, which is what it
Pretty
is.
much.
Real quick, Horace was asking a question about, since we're talking about Kehoe right now. He says, was Keel completely without interaction with Kehoe and Hynek in the 60s and 70s, or was there some back and forth in Keel's early days with those opposing views?
That's a good question. I'm not sure how well he knew or he didn't know Kehoe. I'm
Mhm.
assuming there would have been at least some engagement. He certainly knew Hynek because they were both on the circuit at the same time. He had correspondences with Vallee regularly, and Vallee was essentially Hynek's almost, right-hand man. They did all kinds
Yeah.
of things together, Vallee and Hynek. So Keel would have had interactions with Hynek, I'm sure. With Kehoe, maybe they bumped into each other at UFO conventions back then. I think their ideas were so incredibly polarized, and Keel was so scathing of everybody in that community. Incidentally, there are people in the UFO community still alive who don't like John Keel because he was so scathing.
Yeah.
If you
Yeah,
read anything by Jerome Clark about John Keel,
Oh, yes.
it's vicious.
Yes. Yeah. Again, my dog is actually in the Keelian hunt, and I was reading this thinking, okay, this is a little it's like this feels a little more pointed than it really needs to be if we're going to be if we're trying to be objective on this, because while I agree with virtually all of the points except for that one in particular, but again, I can be sympathetic to his position on that. He, like you said, he didn't suffer fools. He also didn't understand that you can win more friends with honey than vinegar.
Not at all.
In the way he was writing, I'm like, geez, like, again, dude, I'm on your side in this conversation as much as I can be, and I think you're being a little
Oh, yeah, he was rough.
heavy-handed here.
You couldn't do a show I couldn't do Talking Weird, even though I'm in many
Mm-mm.
ways, and I'm not a Keelian, although I'm very sympathetic to Keelian
Yeah.
ideas. In a way, I suppose you could call me a Keelian and I wouldn't be insulted, but I don't know if I'm a true. You call me a Fortean and I won't be insulted at all because I think I'm
Yeah.
positioned there. So in that capacity, both John Keel and I are very similar. But I do think you couldn't have an engagement with somebody and be honest if you thought the way that Keel thinks about the entire ufological subculture. And incidentally, as I've already said, I'm very sympathetic with Keel's position because
Yeah.
I don't think most people in this realm are getting us any closer to the truth. But Keel's they're all like teenagers and housewives, and it's just,
Yeah,
and that was now that wouldn't
Yeah.
be. That I don't even know if you could say that for political correct reasons, but now it wouldn't be
Yeah.
considered an insult. But back in the 70s, to say this whole subculture, mainly the hardcore, are just teenagers and housewives.
Yeah.
I guess the equivalent
And
now is saying somebody
schizophrenics
lives in
and
their
people with
basement with their
obsessive compulsive, and it's like he
Yeah.
is not like if you don't think you know what John Keel really thought at the end of this article, you are not reading it at all, because he was laying it on real thick.
And there's a danger there too. Like there is a danger in being a Keelian, because it's a book. I always talk about this UFO book I've been writing forever, which is essentially my PhD dissertation that I've
Yeah.
considerably recrafted and continue to recraft. But there's a line I write in there, which I'm quite proud of the analogy, because I think it's fairly accurate, is that John Keel and Jacques Vallee and people like that threw these incredible thought bombs into ufology back at this period, back in the late 60s through the late 70s. And they really disrupted the field. This is when Keel was writing about this, a new ufology, because it really seemed like there was going to be one. But I think today, so many of us just stand in the craters that those thought bombs created, saying, we were right. But the UFO community has passed us on by. And you're right, to a degree. MUFON, in that most recent documentary, which we've talked about here, Accidental Truth, seems to be more sympathetic to ultra-terrestrial ideas and things like that. But for the most part, the influence that Keel and Vallee should have had, and other people like them, they certainly weren't the other people. Keel released several of them, as I said before, including Brad Steiger, who did write some. Brad Steiger was a mixed bag. Some of his books were incredible, some, take it or leave it. But they did incredible things. But for the most part, the UFO community moved on to the point where we're still talking about Tic Tac being extraterrestrial. You know what I mean? Like the new dialogue is the same dialogue as the 1950s, and the influence that paraphysical way of looking at UFOs should have been was discarded. Incidentally, Jerome Clark, who I mentioned before, who's super critical of John Keel now, and Keel's critical of him in that pamphlet as well, in fairness. There was a period where both Jerome Clark, who might be one of the most significant nuts and bolts UFO guys still alive, and Lauren Coleman, who now is probably the most significant flesh and blood cryptozoologist still alive, where they wrote a number of books, part of that movement. They wrote, what is it, Creatures of the Outer Edge? What's the other book they wrote? They wrote two. I've got on my shelves. What's the name of the other one? The Unidentified, I think, is the other one, right? The Unidentified.
I think you're right.
Creatures of the Outer Edge.
I'm not doing names at all tonight, and I think it's going to translate into books. But yeah, it's Creatures from the Outer Edge. I think
the Unidentified, I think, are the two. Anyway, my point is they were in that camp for a while as well, but they drifted back into more physical. And in a more physical interpretation of the phenomenon, a more traditional, at least traditional meaning from the 1950s interpretation of the phenomenon. So it's been lost. Now, there are people who are, I consider, in this space still doing great work, like Joshua Cutchin, who we've talked about before, for example. I think Greg Bishop does wonderful work in this space, while also being conscious of the shenanigans of intelligence agencies. Like, he's the person who's probably done more research on the whole Benowitz affair than anybody else in his wonderful book, Project Beta. In fact, I've got Greg Bishop's back on Talking Weird, not this weekend. People should listen to Saturday. This week we've got Greg Bishop back. Greg Bishop is one of the greatest minds working in this field. So there are still people who are doing it, but I think the mainstream of ufology, I think, still is not that different to what Keel's critiquing the old ufology of being in something he was writing in 75 or 73 and then publishing in 75.
Yeah, I think I think you're right on that. Real quick, as far as he spends a lot of time very much proving his point, right? Which again, he's focusing on the subculture, and that is the purpose of this. He's not trying to go all that far afield, but one of the things he does set up, I think, very, very well, is showing how, hey, all of the interpretations that we're seeing today are just, and we've talked about this ad nauseum on this show, is just a new coat of paint on very old ideas that have gone on for a very long time. Pointing out the mathematician, right, from the 200-300 years ago, who was saying, hey, he was having all these visitations and he was seeing other worlds, and then he started to realize, hey, these things aren't what they're claiming to be.
He talks about Swedenborg, right?
Yeah, and he points out that all of these ideas have been around for a very, very long time, and they're just getting new coats of paint, and this newer subculture is just sort of ignoring that, right? And again, 8 pages of footnotes. People, this is a heavily researched paper or article, and he he does something again. The fact that I just absolutely love that he does have all these footnotes. He says, look at this material that no one is talking about anymore, and how clearly this is not what it if it is the same phenomena, it's not what it wasn't what it appeared back then. It's not what it appears to be now. And there are underlying thoughts of what these things could be that have been recurring over and over and over, and we need to talk about it.
Yeah, and again, that was revolutionary in 73.
Mhm.
This is, I mean, Passport to Magonia had only been written in 69, where Jacques Vallee,
Yeah.
who's often the person who's first credited with making this comparison to UFO encounters and fairy faith, for example.
Mhm.
But as I discover more and more, Ray Palmer and Richard Shaver were talking about stuff like that back in the 50s and arguably back in the 40s in the pages of Amazing Stories.
Yeah.
But certainly as a voice, as a respectable scientific voice within the UFO community, you can look to Vallee as the person who interjects that. But Keel's already on top of it then. Now, admittedly, this is 73, but he and Vallee have ongoing correspondences, and they are
Right.
the two main figures of this new ufology that John Keel's talking about. And so to come out of the backside of, that sounds wrong, to come after come after the Condon Committee and to be looking at the kind of the wreck of the scientific and traditional ufological approach to this after Condon, where essentially the first major scientific study financed by the government, the Air Force fobbing off Blue Book now, and it's Condon will decide, and then Condon saying there's nothing here to see, which pretty much puts an end to the expectations that somehow this was going to be worked out by the government and the scientific community.
Yeah.
So after that, you get this incredible both descent into paranoia in the realms of traditional ufology, which John Keel's talking about here, as well as his birth of a new ufology. You get Jacques Vallee, who originally was involved in giving the Condon Committee information along with his friend J. Allen Hynek, walking away and just going, science has failed us. Oh, this is more occultic anyway. And this is a scientist writing that. So you see this, it's almost part of it's funny too, because you can see the layers of outside culture affecting thought as well. Like 69, of course, is, this is the summer of love. This is when hippie and new age thought and all these alternative ideas are emerging. And the new ufology was very much part of this. Steiger was part of this. Keel was part of this. Vallee was part of this. There was a cultural turn. And just the way some old hippies now probably go, oh, like I remember Hunter S. Thompson saying somehow, you can still stand at a high point in California and look and see where we reached the high point before the tide descended back after the summer of love. You can almost look at the new ufology. You can almost look at this piece of Keel's and say, we're almost at the high point now. And then as he does 20 years later, looking back, he doesn't say exactly the same as Hunter S. Thompson did about the summer of love, but he essentially says, it's all gone to hell, which is sad really, but it's true.
Well, he's not wrong, and actually, that's a great sort of foray into Horace Smith's great question, because
it's a fantastic question.
I was thinking about this one too, but for those of you who are listening, Horace very adeptly asks, were we to accept Keel's ideas, is there actually a way to progress further, or are we stuck?
That's something I'm talking about in the book that I'm forever writing, because I'm critical that we do seem to be stuck in those in those holes, in those craters, which the thought bombs of Keel and Vallee made. I think we have to look to how if you know the code, if you know that this is not extraterrestrial, if this is somehow part of a psychologically and it influenced the culture and there might be an occultic or a spiritual side, how then do you engage with this phenomenon? I think the question might become, there's a couple of points. One is that it's important to look at actual experiences without trying to put your beliefs onto the experiences, which is very hard for anybody to do, including a Keelian or a Fordian or anybody, to look at an experience and go, what's the naked truth of that experience which somebody's reporting? The problem, of course, that becomes is how culturally affected is the experiencer themselves. So even if you're looking at the experiencer without bringing your own cultural or belief baggage or trying to leave it at the door, how much of that cultural and belief baggage has the experiencer taken with them into the experience? I suspect I have both a positive and a very negative answer here. I
Mhm.
suspect if an answer is to come, it's to come through an experiencer. But let's say an experiencer can see through the cultural baggage. Is anybody going to believe them anyway, or is it just going to be another, crackpot coming back, wanting to tell us some great cosmic truth? Because I think
Right.
there is the secret. I think the secret is the phenomenon and the direct engagement with the phenomenon. I think it's important for people like Keel to theorize. I think in some ways that's far more important than research, theorizing. And Keel did both, theorize and research. But
Mhm.
I do think the secret is within the experience. The secret is it within the phenomenon. How do you get to the core of that is the question.
And I think this is one of those points that we both agree and disagree on and because like you said, Fort was very uh, not dismissive, but he definitely looked down on science, right? This is, and again, to your point, and that you've made quite a few times, is the entire point of 40 and of the 14 field is that it's material that doesn't fit neatly into science, it doesn't really fit within that construct. Which I do tend to agree with insofar as laboratory science, it doesn't fit within it because we don't have the ability to observe it, right? Again, you go back 600 years, germ theory would have been completely pointless because you couldn't see it. In fact, we've talked about this a lot. It's entirely possible we just don't have the technology to even understand what it is we're dealing with to begin with. The paradigms that we're even looking at this all in, maybe the real answer may not be on that table, right? Um, Again, I come from a religious perspective. I freely recognize that when we talk about angels and demons or the supernatural, that's in many ways, those are words that just mean something I don't really understand, right? I can't classify what this thing is. When we talk about, people talk about beings of energy, that means nothing. It doesn't actually mean something. It's just a way that we can say, okay, well, it's something that's not material, like this cup is material, right? But the construct is maybe to look at, just maybe not even on the table, because our understanding of reality itself is not really on that level. However, this is where I think we would disagree. I do think science can, again, the problem is it has to be done openly, honestly, and with humility. And as we know, those things don't get you grant money oftentimes. um is that there's ways to at least notice that there's something happening, right? Even before we could, I always forget if it was Neptune or Uranus, but which one was which, because again, dyslexia. However, like, we knew there was another planet out there because of the wobble of, I think it was Neptune's wobble that told us that Uranus was there. So we couldn't see Uranus, but we knew something was there because of the wobble. There are wobbles in the universe, in people's experiences, that I think we can explore to a limited fashion. Are we going to come to, like, this is the solid answer from the, that would satisfy, uh, that would satisfy it in progress from a scientific view? Maybe not. It may honestly be more philosophical in a lot of ways, because this may be something that we, from a being able to say, okay, the way I can say this cup is transparent, I can tell you the material it's made out of, I can tell you this, how this works. We may not be able to do that with the truly exotic phenomena that we're discussing here, and that Keel is discussing in the article. Just saw that. But we can definitely say there is something here, and it's fitting these parameters. And I think that's progress. To be able to even have that conversation, I think, is progress. And to be able to at least say, you know what, whatever this thing is, it ain't this thing, right? It's not a bunch of Vulcans coming here, on Battlestar Galactica to say howdy. That's not what's happening. And I think that's important.
Horace, who is an astronomer and an emeritus professor at Michigan State University, said Uranus's motions and Saturn's led to the prediction of the existence of Neptune.
Yeah, I knew it was
Even
one or
though-
the other. I just couldn't remember which one it was. Thank you, Horace.
I just wonder also, and this is a conversation which is obviously difficult to have, period, if there isn't a subjectivity to the nature of reality which makes it inherently indecipherable. And that's a terribly pessimistic realization to come to, that
Yeah.
none of this might be solvable. And to be honest, that's my gut suspicion. Because we haven't solved, how long have we been on this planet? I mean, there's various interpretations of that as well, depending what camp you sit in. But since we've had these type of discussions, even if we just rewind to when Keel probably started looking at stuff, right?
Yeah.
We're no closer to any understanding of any of this, whether it's Bigfoot or whether it's UFOs or whether it's Blessed Virgin Mary apparitions or whether it's specters in the back hallway of the old family mansion. People have all kinds of different theories, but we're no closer to having any way of determining what any of this stuff is. That's the reality.
Mhm.
And I don't see all of a sudden there's going to be an incredible sea change where we have this realization that, oh, we should have been looking here. Here's the answer to the, here's the unified, theory to the paranormal. We've worked it out. I think there are unified theories. I think people like John Keel have presented things, which is somewhat a unified theory to explain everything, but an actual to somehow then turn that into a working hypothesis that you can go out and test or
objectively observe and test is the issue.
Exactly.
Although I'm just saying, when the Spookatron 5000 patent pending comes out, I'm just saying that's when everything's going to work out. That's what I'm saying.
That is what we're waiting for.
That's what we're waiting for.
When are you going to file that patent at the patent office for the Spookatron?
Do you know how hard it is to file a patent? I mean this because NDA, but there are projects I have worked on that are currently 3 years they've been working on this stuff to get into patent. Dude, patent law is insane.
Wow.
It's insane. It really is. But that is a conversation for another episode. Thank you, Dean.
Thank you, Jason.
And thank you to the chat. Again, as always, y'all are wonderful. Love you. Love y'all. This is one of the highlights of my week, is to come on and particularly when Dean and I can have at least a little bit of conflict, we
disagree on a lot of this stuff. We're just nice and friendly, but the reality is there are all kinds of things here we disagree on.
Yeah, it is. And which is where we have which is where the fun is. It's where the fun is. But you know what? There's always going to be more fun to have, and we will have it next time behind the card catalog. We'll see y'all later.